very grateful for this opportunity to highlight concerns about a lack of transparency, particularly in how BBC Northern Ireland, but I'm sure much more widely, how the BBC use public money. I previously had this subject down for debate, but for a variety of reasons had to withdraw it. These matters are, as I say, not unique to Northern Ireland, but for the purposes of my speech, I will focus to some degree on BBC NI. The BBC's mission is, quote, to inform, educate and entertain audiences with programmes and services of high quality, originality and value, unquote. The BBC used to be considered a reliable source of news and informative programming. It was the broadcaster to go to at times of crisis or turmoil. It was the dependable, publicly funded broadcaster. I'm sorry to inform the House that as a result of various events over the last few years, the BBC's standing has been diminished. Correspondence from MPs frequently goes either unanswered totally or avoiding the issues that are raised in correspondence. Questions about the use of public money are ignored, or else they have a veil of secrecy pulled over them. I have concluded that the BBC fat cats in Belfast are either incredibly arrogant or incredibly shifty. One thing they're not, however, is open and transparent. Having written to the BBC, I have had to come here today to raise serious issues. I use the term fat cats because some of the best people in the BBC are the lowest paid. The foot soldier producers and editors who work long shifts and arrange all the programmes. I have long argued for maximum transparency from the BBC. I wish, Mr. Bowen, to break this down into several sections. The first is about pay transparency. The BBC nationally long resisted the public demand for pay transparency. They eventually agreed to publish some presenters' salaries. 96 stars, as they're called, had their salary published. Their combined salaries were worth almost £30 million. The public is somewhat better informed as to how their money has been used. We now know that the BBC believe men should get more money than women for doing the same task. There was an outrageous gender pay disparity. It took a decade, however, for the BBC to be dragged to the point where they published all salaries over £150,000 per year. But since then, the BBC have indicated in recent months and weeks that more staff will be moved off the direct payroll, thus they will not feature in any published list next year, even though they're paid in excess of the £150,000 benchmark. So much for greater transparency. Whether this is motivated to reduce BBC staff personal tax liabilities or just to avoid public scrutiny, or both, it is a shameful insight into the complete disregard the BBC top brass has for transparency. There is an outrageous double standard at play. While BBC presenters will question elected representatives and others in the public purse about their salary and office costs, they will hide behind a veil of secrecy about their own publicly funded 200,000, 300,000, 400,000 and more salaries per year. I am glad that salaries, overheads, etc. in this Parliament is accessible to the taxpayer for scrutiny. That's how it should be, Mr. Bowen. Why then should public money funding the BBC be treated any differently? I don't agree with BBC staff avoiding tax by channeling money through obscure personal service companies. This House should consider the ethics of the practice where public money is concerned. The second matter I wish to touch on is about transparency relating to complaints. A constituent approached me because they had made the following very simple request under FOI. I request the number of complaints recorded against matters carried out by BBC Northern Ireland for the following outlets. And they then listed 7 programmes: BBC Good Morning Ulster, BBC Nolan Radio, BBC Nolan Live Television, BBC Talkback, BBC Evening Extra, BBC Newsline and BBC NI website. It's not an unreasonable request. How many complaints have been lodged? The following reply was received by my constituent. The information that you have requested is excluded from the Act because it is held for the purposes of journalism, art and literature. The BBC is therefore not obliged to provide this information to you and will not be doing so on this occasion. So much for transparency. This reply, Mr. Bowen, was sent by Mr. Mark Adair. He, according to the reply, is BBC Northern Ireland's Head of Corporate and Community Affairs. Mr. Adair told my constituent that he does hold the information, but he needs it for the purposes of journalism, art and literature. Clearly nonsensical. Why would a publicly funded media organisation not be prepared to make public the number of complaints made against its programmes by members of the public? The third area I want to move to, Mr. Bowen, is the commissioning of programmes. The BBC across the UK, but I will deal with Northern Ireland, commissions independent companies to produce programmes. Yet independent production companies, editing companies and camera and lighting specialists are concerned that they don't get a fair deal. There are stories that I have heard of slow payments, reduced payments, and a culture of fear fresh in my mind as I heard these instances at first hand from those affected as I began to probe the commissioning process. I wanted to establish what auditing mechanism exists when the contract is awarded for a programme and after the product, the finished programme, has been delivered and appeared. I wanted to know how the BBC, as the main contractor, could be sure that subcontractors such as camera operators, lighting operators, editors, etc., were actually paid for their work under the contract. I asked some simple questions from Susan Lavelle. She is the head of multi-platform commissioning for BBC Northern Ireland. I have yet to receive satisfactory answers to my questions. I numbered the questions. There were 18 in total. I have been offered a private briefing, and so numerous were the links in the response that my printer ran out of ink and paper before I could get them all printed. The briefing is a nice offer, Mr. Bowen. Very nice, and I'm sure I will take it up. But I would prefer answers to questions. This Tuesday I emailed Susan Lavelle again when I knew this debate was to be on. I made it even more succinct than the previous time. 3 straight questions. When programmes are commissioned and public money granted, how is the use of this money audited? Perfectly reasonable, I would have thought. Number 2, is an external auditor employed to ensure this public money is appropriated in an ethical manner? Perfectly reasonable. And number 3, if a commission is granted, can the contracted production company then seek additional monies for travel and other unforeseen production costs? I would have assumed, Mr. Bowen, as a viewer, set aside that I am an MP, that that's a perfectly reasonable set of queries. I received a reply yesterday. It's funny how minds can be exercised when a debate is going to be held, Mr. Bowen, and it takes weeks and months otherwise. But I got a reply yesterday. Expenditure profiles are a routine feature of programme proposals and allow us to make an informed assessment. I always get fearful, Mr. Bowen, when I hear answers from large companies that talk about informed assessments. But this was an informed assessment of value for money, and we routinely audit our work and output against a range of metrics. The key words there, Mr. Bowen, are we routinely audit. One of the questions was, is an external auditor employed? The answer contained the words, we routinely audit. I think I get an answer to that question, even though indirectly. When a programme is commissioned, delivered and broadcast, invoices relating to that contract should then be published online. This is what happens in many other areas of public service. I want to turn now, Mr. Bowen, to a specific example. In October 2014, a BBC Northern Ireland series was entitled Story of a Lifetime. It was broadcast. According to the credits, this series was produced for BBC NI by a company called Third Street Studios. However, according to Companies House, Third Street Studios was incorporated on the 2nd of December, after the series was broadcast. Almost 1 year ago, I cited this example and I asked the BBC, number one, to whom and when did BBC NI award the contract for the 2014 series Story of a Lifetime? Number two, what address did BBC NI use to communicate the commission to Third Street Studios? And number three, did BBC NI check if Third Street Studios was incorporated before the programme was commissioned? To date, Mr. Bowen, neither the company involved nor the BBC have been able to tell me where Third Street Studios' office is located, how much the contract was for, and to whom the contract was awarded. I understand the director of Third Street Studios is a BBC presenter. Indeed, according to the map on their website, their office is at Belfast City Hall. On the About Us section of the Third Street Studios website, it declares, we pride ourselves in understanding mass market television. We don't do niche, we do massive, end of quote. This production company is so massive, Mr. Bowen, I can't find their office in Belfast. So massive is it. In fact, when I went online, according to the map, the Google map that you get, it is fairly prestigious in the front of the City Hall in Belfast at a taxi rank. So I think we have some questions that need answering again. When I emailed the company and its director, he said, and I asked him the questions that I've outlined, I don't think that it would be helpful or appropriate, unquote, to answer my questions. For clarity, I asked about the procurement process, the contract value, the date the contract was awarded, and the tendering process for appointing subcontractors. Remember, Mr. Bowen, this is for a series that has already been broadcast on BBC television. The company director said, my work could only properly be understood if equivalent information about all other production companies and their contracts with the BBC were to be placed in the public domain. So I'll go if you get everyone else to go. That's effectively what he was saying. This is further evidence of straightforward and simple questions being ignored. Mr. Chairman, we need full transparency in BBC commissioning, and we need evidence that BBC commission contracts are externally audited. Yes, I will.
I thank him for giving me. He's making a very sound case about the BBC, but I wondered if he might agree that it was this government's call for increased transparency, maybe not in all the areas that my honourable friend is covering, but certainly about the pay rates, that it has actually unlocked many of the things that we're going to debate today. So this government is definitely holding the BBC to account, perhaps should do more, but is definitely working in this area.
I thank my honourable friend for that intervention, and I agree with her. The campaign over the past number of years to get further transparency is a work in progress. We are much further advanced now than we were 10 or 12 years ago, but as I'm outlining, there is much more work to do. The fourth area I want to cover, Mr. Bowen, is BBC accuracy and honesty. The BBC prides itself on posing questions, and all of us here are subject to those questions. But it's not very good at providing answers, Mr. Bowen. In two instances during the past year, there have been very serious questions for the corporation in Northern Ireland to answer. A green energy scheme with an initial potential overspend of public money is currently subject to a public inquiry. So I don't intend to trespass on issues that are best dealt with in that inquiry. However, the executive in Northern Ireland was collapsed by Sinn Féin under the pretext of what they claimed was a mishandling of that scheme. A BBC Radio Ulster programme carried this topic in the early part of this year for 56 consecutive days on its daily programme. The presenter of the programme who just happens to be the director of 3rd Street Studios, used inaccurate and outrageous commentary. I'll just use 2 brief quotes. "One of the biggest financial scandals to have ever happened in Northern Ireland. Under the government's watch, 400 million of your money has been allowed to go up in smoke," he said. End of quote. "What it means is hundreds of millions of pounds of your money cannot go into schools, education, other departments in our country because the money has been squandered, the money has been wasted." End of quote. This continued, Mr. Bowen, for, as I say, a prolonged period until I appeared on the programme and confronted this deliberate misrepresentation. I pointed out that as the scheme had only begun and was scheduled to last for 20 years, why did this presenter keep saying that the public's money had been wasted and gone up in smoke? Only after that, coupled with strong letters of protest from my party to the BBC hierarchy, was this reprehensible language stopped. Yes, I will.
I'm most grateful to the Honourable Gentleman for giving way. He's providing a surprisingly compelling case. But is it not the case that the scandal that he was referring to actually brought down the Northern Ireland government, and as such is entirely newsworthy for 56 days or more?
Well, I have no objection whatsoever to any media concentrating on the events, particularly if they are events of such import. But when they scandalously misrepresent, as those comments did, and others' comments did, and then were changed after I and others confronted the presenter on his misrepresentation, proves that the BBC knew that they had overstepped the mark in the initial comments. But I take his point. I have no quibble or argument with the BBC about deliberating to a great extent on that issue. But part of that issue was compounded by the presenter's gross misrepresentation of the facts. A substantial complaint about those inaccuracies was lodged with the BBC and is still ongoing. The BBC have not yet comprehensively responded to the complaints from 8 months ago. The complaint process is obviously laborious and bureaucratic. For those who haven't yet embarked upon it, Mr. Bowen, I can attest to that fact. Another example, and this is a very, very insidious example, Mr. Bowen. In October last year, BBC NI television broadcast a Spotlight programme. Spotlight is an investigative programme in Northern Ireland which has won awards down through the years. It looked at people who had been victims of alleged shooting by police officers in the early stages of the Troubles. The programme was critical of the police, and both serving and former officers were concerned at the one-sided picture that this programme portrayed. Shortly after the broadcast, I was contacted by someone who informed me that the reporter who conducted the interviews and carried out the broadcast on the BBC had in fact herself previously been a serving police officer. So I wrote to the reporter in the following terms. I write to confirm some details regarding a recent BBC Spotlight programme. I would be grateful if you could answer the following questions. 1. Have you ever served as a police officer in Northern Ireland? If yes, please outline the circumstances which led to you leaving the police. Have you ever been known by any other name than, and I named her? If so, what? Because my understanding was she married and her surname had changed from the broadcast, from a previous incident. 3, as the presenter of an investigative programme which was critical of the police, do you believe you had a conflict of interest? 4, did BBC NI ask you to complete a declaration of interest prior to this programme? 5, how much public money was paid to you for your services in that programme? And 6, and most critical, Mr. Bowen, does the below BBC news story from 10 years previously relate to you? That news story was of a serving police officer who was in court, who faced a charge, not a terrorist charge, a charge, and the judge, in his concluding remarks, said to this person, this police officer, she should have known better to give a proper name rather than her sister's. He bound her over to be of good behaviour for a year on her own bond of £500. The judge warned her that she could forfeit some or all of this money if she breached the order. I am informed that the person who was in court and who subsequently left the police and joined the BBC and did a programme which was critical of the police, that no explanation has been given as to why that is the case, either why that reporter did what they did they declare, as I asked, did they give a declaration of interest, that she was a former serving police officer? Did the BBC know that and then allow her to do a programme which was critical of the police? Mr. Bowen, we are all aware, if I or anyone else in this chamber, or in the main chamber, were to raise an issue, and it was subsequently discovered that we had an interest in the issue and didn't declare it, I leave you to guesstimate what would happen in the public arena if we were to do that. That's why we have a declaration of interest, and the BBC also have one. So I did not receive an answer to any of those questions. I didn't even receive an acknowledgement. I then resubmitted this debate in March and was unable to proceed at that stage, and I asked again the same questions, didn't receive a response then either. But what happened this week, strangely to say again, after I submitted a third time, I did receive from the aforementioned Mr. Mark Adair. We have been made aware of your emails to a named BBC journalist. This is 9 months after I began this, and 24 hours before a debate, we have become aware of your emails to a named BBC journalist. The BBC has robust arrangements in place to avoid any potential conflicts of interest. We would be grateful if you direct any future correspondence about BBC staff and or policy to me or to our Director's office. Again, avoiding the questions. The fifth and final area, Mr. Bowen, I wish to cover is declaration of interest, which follows on from my previous issue. In Parliament, MPs, ministers and civil servants are very aware of the need to declare interest. And as I said previously, the BBC also has a process for its journalists to declare interests that they may have. When a constituent using the FOI asked to see the declaration of interest of some BBC presenters and senior staff, the reply that they did receive was, all staff are required to complete a declaration of personal interests upon joining the BBC. That's good as far as it goes, Mr. Bowen. But it then went on to say, we will not be disclosing because the information that you have requested is excluded from the Act because it is held for the purposes of, guess what? Journalism, art or literature. It seems to cover everything, Mr. Bowen. When you don't want to tell people, give them answers to questions, use the cloak of journalism, art or literature.
Would the member
yes, sir.
Would the member agree with me that, and I know that he, like myself, many people have contacted me with concerns around some of the so-called news programmes. And I think that there is an issue because news programmes very often now do straddle into entertainment programmes. And many people have contacted me with concern that actually there has been, in the view of the public, a narrative set, an agenda set, and then the programme sets about getting participants that support that narrative, that key messages throughout those programmes emphasise that. And the point that the member is raising about declaration of interest is particularly important because unless the public knows what those interests are, then we don't and we can't scrutinise properly to see if that person is appropriately carrying out their public duties as a public service broadcaster, regardless of whether they're contracted in or not, that they are being fair and balanced, they are presenting the facts and they are presenting all perspectives to ensure that the public has the best opportunity to come to their own conclusions on these important matters.
Thank my honourable friend for that intervention, and she is right, and we have noticed that particularly in the last 3 or 4 years for some reason where the BBC has become much more sensationalist. But Mr. Bowen, I put a very straightforward question which I think most people, even the BBC, should be able to answer this. What's the point of having a declaration of interest if no one knows what's in it? What is the point of that? Why would you do that? Why would you ask people to declare any interest they may have, and then if anyone wants to find out, because someone's doing a programme. Did they have an interest? We're not going to tell you, and of course we're not going to tell you under the auspices of journalism, art or literature, the great catch-all. I think it is an entirely reasonable request that all BBC's presenters' declarations of interest should be published. Mr Bowen, I don't expect the Minister to be able to respond definitively to every single avenue that I have taken the debate down today, but I think these matters need to be aired so that the BBC at hierarchy level, that DCMS and the Minister are aware of what has happened and the lengths to which some of us have gone to try and get answers to very straightforward questions. The bottom line here, Mr Bowen, is that the BBC needs to radically alter the way they carry out their business, using our money. That's the point. You're using public money. Their procedures need overhauling. Their lack of transparency is appalling. The case for change was never more apparent than it is now. Thank you.